Before we can create and animate fire, we first need to choose the object that is going to define the shape of our fire. And there's a lot of different objects we can use for this. One thing to note is that Booleans do not work well for this. We can use metablobs, but for right now I'm going to start out just with a cylinder, and then we can convert this to other objects once we've already created the material. I'm going to double click just to expand our main camera view to full view. I'm just going to reposition the camera so we can see this object a little bit better. And since we're going to be working with animation, I also want to hit F11 on the keyboard. And that's going to bring up our timeline. If you don't have that keyboard shortcut set, you can go to Display, Timeline, Show Timeline. And we're just going to start out with it like this, with just the default settings for right now. And we'll actually get into changing some of those settings once we have the material created. So we're going to double click just on the preview for our material, and that's going to bring up our material editor. If you're in the basic material editor, it's just going to look like this. You want to make sure you click on the advanced material editor. And now I'm going to change the type of material we're working with from a simple material to a volumetric material. And we can take a look at the update. And then we want to go to the Lighting and Effects tab, and we want to change our model, our lighting model, from uniform to volume shaded. And since we're going to be creating fire, we also want to go up to the Effects tab and turn off Cast Shadows and Receive Shadows, because we don't want this affected by any other light in the scene, because it's going to be producing its own light. Also, if we take a look at the current scene, I'm just using the default sky. Well, I want to change this so that we're really focusing on just the fire. And what we're going to do is go up to Atmosphere, Load Atmosphere, and if we go to Effects and Other, we can see that we have black back, and this is this one right here. I'm going to click OK, and this is going to give us a completely black background. What I also want to do is we can either remove our ground plane, or we can just change it so that it is black. And we can do this by turning down our diffuse and ambient in the Effects tab. And we can also change our color. Just right mouse click, edit color map, change our current color to black, and click OK. OK, and OK again. Now we see a little bit around the horizon. So if you wanted to remove your ground plane, you can easily do that. So we can just click on that ground plane and click delete, and now we don't see that at all. I'm also going to delete our sunlight, so we could just click on our sunlight in our layers and just hit delete. And now we can see our object is a little bit darker than it was, but we don't want any outside interference because we just want to be focusing on this specific material and how it's going to look illuminating itself. We can always add that sunlight again later, and that way we can take a look at how it's going to react in specific scenes where we do have sunlight, and it is during the day. So let's go back to editing our material. We're going to double click to open up our advanced material editor. And another thing I want to do is change our mapping mode from parametric to standard. So we're going to work with object standard. Now if you plan on creating just a basic size for your fire, and then you want to change your object size and have the fire stay the same, then what you can do is use your mapping mode as world standard. But we want to stay away from the parametric option because we don't want, if we're going to be stretching our object or scaling it up and down, we don't want to change the actual surface and stretch that out. And that's what that will do. So we're going to stick with object standard right now. And if we go to the Lighting and Effects tab, I'm going to turn down our diffusion to 0, our ambient to 0, and our luminosity up to 100%. If we take a look, and now we can see our object is nice and bright. And we will actually be expanding beyond this 100%, but right now we're just going to keep it at that. We'll probably end up around 150 to 200% to really get the best effect for this fire. But let's switch over to the Color and Density tab. And we can see a couple of different options. We have our overall density, fuzziness, and quality boost. If we increase our overall density, and I want to raise this up kind of high, we can see a little more of the volume. And there's two options that are really going to affect the shape of our fire, and that is whether or not we use fuzziness or the distance field. And we'll be going back and forth between those to see which is going to look best for this specific shape. So now that we have some of our basic settings kind of set up already, we want to start to define the actual shape of our fire. So we're going to go into Density Production, under Color and Density, right mouse click and go to Edit Function. Because we're going to be controlling this entirely with a function to really define the shape of our fire and cutting out the areas of our volumetric so it does look and react like fire. So we're going to click on our Density Output node, and what we can also do is just pull down these top settings and frame, and that way we can see this a little bit better. Click on our density, and we're going to add a fractal node. Now right now we just have a simple fractal, which will work quite well for this. Our current noise setting is Perlin Noise Gradient, so we can see Perlin Noise Gradient. And a lot of these different options will work for creating fire, and we'll be able to create a variety of different types by using different settings. We could use cellular patterns, and we could use the drought setting, and that will also produce a fairly realistic looking fire. But for right now, I'm going to stick with Perlin Noise Gradient, and let's just go ahead and edit this. I'm going to change our wavelength. Since we're working with a smaller object, we're going to need a little bit of a smaller wavelength. I'm going to bring this down to 0.2 on all of our axes. And actually, if we take a look, our z-axis is currently our up and down axis. And because we're working with fire, which is a little more stretched on that specific axis, and we have the flames reaching upward, we want to make that setting larger than the other two. So I'm going to create 0.4, and now we can see that showing up already in our preview. I'm also going to name this, and we're just going to give this a title of fire underscore main underscore shape. Or we could also just have this as fire, and then the description, we could cut that and have the description as main shape. And now we can see that fire is showing up, and we see our description, and that can be very helpful when you're working with multiple nodes. I also want to turn down our largest feature just a little bit because we don't want too much variation in this, although we do want a little. So we can bring this down to about 5.4. I'm also going to increase our roughness and our gain. Another thing I want to do is just change our preview options. If we go up to the top, and I'm going to change our objects to be displayed to a 2D plane. And that way we can look specifically at just the fractal that we're creating and just that node, so we can see exactly what texture we're going to be working with. And I'm going to click OK. And let's take a look at our preview. Right now we really don't see a whole lot of definition, so we need to start adjusting our fuzziness or using the distance field. And a lot of that can be directly related to our function scale as well. And currently right now our function scale is set to 1, and we have our function and our actual node set to 0.2 and then 0.4 for that z-axis. But I'm going to bring down our function scale right now just to 0.5 for all of our axes, since we're really defining that up and down within the node, and we don't need to worry about that within function scale. And we can let that update, and we can see a little bit more definition, but overall, we still need to adjust our fuzziness. I'm going to bring that back to 1, so we're back to the default, and let's start adjusting our fuzziness. I'm just going to increase this value to about 94%, and now we can start to see some of that shape showing up. But overall, it still looks like a cylinder, and we might need to use something else. Now this fuzziness can also be controlled by a function and a node. So we can take a look at that, but first let's click on Use Distance Field and take a look at another setting for adjusting our overall shape. And the more we bring in our field depth, we can see it starts to remove more of that outside cylinder shape, but it still doesn't really have the shape of fire. So let's go back into our function editor for our density, and I'm going to increase our gain, make it a little bit higher, so we're around 3.4, about 3.5 for our gain, and we can click OK. Let's let that update, and now we can see a lot more definition and more holes in spacing. We can increase our field depth, and we can see that a little bit better. Let's go back to field depth, increase that a little more, and we can see a little bit of a better shape. Now overall, this is still going to look sort of cylindrical shaped, just because we are using a cylinder. Like I was saying, we can use metablobs for this, and that will improve the overall shape. But we're going to change that a little bit later. And we're just going to start out with this simple shape, and we could always change that to a box as well, and stretch that out, and get some different types of effects. But with these current settings, let's start taking a look at changing our color so that it starts to match the color of fire. I'm actually going to use our density function and our density node fractal that we're using to create this current density for controlling our color. And that way, everything sort of matches up a lot better. And you'll see how that shows up. So we can right mouse click, go to Edit Function, and now within the function editor, we want to select our fractal node, go up to the top, and we're going to select Copy. I'm just going to click OK. We're going to move to our volumetric color, right mouse click, go to Edit Function, and now we have this constant node, which is really just a placeholder for what we're going to be pasting in. So we want to go up to the top, and I've just clicked to create sort of a red box to define where I want to paste in this current node. And actually, if I select our constant, it will not replace it. It'll just simply add it next to it. So we do need to redo the connections. So I'm just going to paste in that current node. We're going to select our constant. We can delete it. I'm also going to frame this so we can see it a little bit better. Bring down our position, reframe. And now I can take our filter, connect it to our node, and then grab the top and connect to position. So now our color is going to be controlled by this node. We also need to define our color map, but I'm going to do this outside of the function editor. So I'm going to click OK. And if we take a look, we're still going to see exactly the same effect, and that's because our color is still completely constant. So we need to change this to a gradient map. And now you can either create your own, or we can load in one of the maps that are already available and customize it, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to Load Color Map. If we take a look under Rocks and Grass, we can see that we have a red, brown, yellow. There's also a sandstone. And we can choose between these two to set up our initial color for our fire. And I'm actually going to select sandstone just because we have a lot more intense color, and click OK. Now we're going to let that refresh. and we can start to see the fire sort of coming about. We also want to check and make sure that our function scales are exactly the same, because we are using the same node, but since we can change our function scale individually for both our density and our color, we just want to make sure that those match up correctly. And one thing I do want to do is bring down both of our function scales. And let's just bring them down to 0.7 on all axes for both the density and our color, and we can take a look at the preview. And we can start to see that show up a little bit better. Now, one thing we do need to do is adjust our luminosity. So we have luminous set to 100%. Well, we can actually go over that value by typing in a specific number. So I'm going to type in 150, and we'll let that update. And now we can see a much brighter, much more realistic looking fire effect. And we could bring that up even higher to 200. And now we can see we have some whiter areas showing up, and it looks a little more realistic. And our overall shape looks like it might need a little bit of work. But first, what I want to do is adjust our quality boost, because a lot of what we're seeing with some of the grain and some of the different values is dependent on our quality boost. So I'm going to boost this up to a +1, and it's going to take a little bit longer to render, but it is going to look a little bit better. Also going to right mouse click on our preview, and for our preview quality, you can see we have best on. And that really is going to give us the best representation of what this fire is going to look like. We can also increase our quality boost even higher, and we can see it starts to take a little bit longer to render, but it starts to become more blurred, and we might need to define our density production a little bit more in order to see a little bit sharper on the edges. But we can tweak that a little bit later. I'm going to turn our quality boost down to +1, and now we can start to see some of that detail coming back, mostly being represented as sort of a grain. And even though our quality boost will give us a much cleaner render and a lot less grain, it is not always necessary to have it at a really high number, because sometimes we can actually lose detail, and since we're animating this and we'll have a bit of motion blur on, we really don't need to adjust that quality boost. So let's start taking a look at animating what we currently have and taking a look at it, and then we can start tweaking from there. But just one thing before we do that, I'm going to create just a very quick render of our current shape. So I'm going to go up to our render options, and our little camera, right mouse click to pull up our render options. I'm going to change this to broadcast, render to screen, and I'm going to set this to 800 by 600, and I'll just render that. And if we take a look at our post-render options, you can see that I have the natural film response on, and if I turn that off, we can start to see a little bit differently how that's going to look, and really with the natural film response it will look much better. As with pretty much any sort of scene you're creating, natural film response will create a much better looking render. We could also adjust the exposure, bring that up, but really what you want to be doing in these settings just by increasing your luminosity. So I'm going to bring that down to 0 and click OK. And now we can see our finished render. And this current frame is actually saved in the content folder under Fire Renders as FireFrame01 JPEG. And that way you can see this without the compression of the video. But overall this looks pretty good right now. Of course the way this is reacting on the top looks a little bit unrealistic, but that will change once we start animating it, and it'll look a little bit different. We can also adjust our density and other things to sort of dissipate towards the top, and maybe we'll look into that a little bit later. Let's go ahead and just close this out, and now we're going to focusing on animating. And we have a lot of different options we can use to animate this fire and manipulate it. And I'm going to start out with just some of the automatic settings by going to the Lighting and Effects tab, and we're going to be using Velocity of Material Origin. And we're just going to start out with that, and then we can start working on turbulence and rotation and setting up some different effects by using those a little bit later. And now before I start changing the material origin and the velocity of material origin settings, we need to determine how long our animation is going to be. So if we go down to the timeline, we can right mouse click on the timeline to scroll through, and if you hold down Control and right mouse click, we can change the zoom option so that we can view more frames and more time. I just want to be able to see at least 5 seconds because we're going to do a 5-second animation. So what I want to do is just drag our timeline all the way down to 5 seconds. And because we're going to be using the velocity of material origin, that's really not going to set up any keyframes. So we can't really determine how long the animation is going to be. So we need to set a keyframe for something that we're not really going to affect or change, but we want it to represent how long our animation is going to be. So with our cylinder selected, we want to go to this little keyframe section over here, right mouse click, and add a position keyframe, because we're not going to be modifying its position. And since we're currently not setting up any material keyframes where we're changing it over time, this will give us a nice 5-second animation where we can modify certain settings, and then if we render it, we have an active time frame. Because if we were just to leave this and set our material origin, and we went to render, we actually wouldn't have an animation. And that's just because we don't have anything defined. So we've set the position, since we're not really changing the position. If you are going to change the position, then you have a keyframe for it, and you can. So now we can set our velocity of material origin. But what we want to do is go back to our first frame. So we're going to go over to our timeline. On the left for our play and stop properties. And the left button, the one all the way on the left, is going to bring us to the first keyframe. So we're just going to click on that, and now we're at the beginning of the animation, so that way we're not setting any specific keyframes for our material. I'm going to change our velocity of material origin on the z-axis, which is going to be our up and down. And that's because what we want to do is move our current density production and volumetric color, and basically our function, and move that in a direction basically upward so that the flames look like they're moving. And this setting largely depends on the overall size of your object and your material. And since I'm just using the defaults for this cylinder, and I haven't scaled it or sized it, if you use the defaults, then you should achieve the same effect. So we're going to go to the z-axis, type in -20 to start out with, and click OK. And now what we can do is start scrubbing through our animation, and we can see our flames start moving upward. And we can see how it looks a lot better towards the top in different parts of the animation. And we're just kind of moving that texture through the area. So we're going to set up just a small preview so we can get a sense of time and how everything is going to look. So what I want to do is we've got this little film, and we have the ability to left mouse click and generate a preview, or we can right mouse click and set up our options. So we're going to right mouse click first, and now we can set up our preview options. Our current animation is 24 frames per second, so we're working with film. And our preview frame rate is going to be 15 for right now. So we're seeing 15 frames per second rather than the 24, but it'll still give us a very good idea of overall timing and placement of our current animation. I'm going to change this to final, and that way we get a little bit of a better preview. And our preview size, I'm going to bring down to 2 times. And actually, I'm just going to bring our frame rate down to 12. And that way we're looking at half our speed, or half of our amount of frames per second that we normally have. And then once we click OK, it's going to start generating our preview. And we can see it's going to start rendering our frames on the bottom. It also gives us the overall amount of frames. We can see 61, and our progress, time left, and then the current resolution of our preview. So we're going to let that finish out. And now our preview is finished, and we can click play to watch the animation. Or we can just scrub through and take a look at the actual frames. And if you pay attention to a specific frame, you can see the animation. Now, because the frame rate for this tutorial is a lot less than the actual frame rate of our animation, it's not going to appear entirely correct. But if we look at the actual frames as we scrub through, we can get a very good idea of the overall animation. Another thing to keep in mind is your preview might not be playing at the same speed as you actually have defined. So even though we have 5 seconds, our preview might actually take 7 seconds or longer to show. So sometimes the best preview is really just to render out the animation and take a look. You can use smaller settings if you need to, so it's a lot quicker. But it really is the best way to check your timing, because if this fire is moving too slow or too fast, it's going to be hard to tell with just this basic preview that we have. So if we render it out, we can take a look at the actual speed, and then we can adjust that velocity of material origin, either increasing it from 20, maybe up to 30 if we want it a little bit faster, or even higher. Or if it's going a little too fast, we can slow it down just by decreasing that number. By looking at the animation, though, and just our preview, we can see that we might want to add a little more definition. Because if we're taking a look at some of these frames, we can see the overall fill of our fire is pretty much the entire object. And we might want to see a little more spacing in there, and a lot more of these black areas showing up to really show some flames. So we can adjust our fractal node and our density and change some of those settings. So we're going to double click on our preview, and we also want to make sure that we're at our first frame. We're going to go to our color and density, edit our function, and in our function output observer, which we have open, we can see the preview. Of course, this isn't the exact preview of our current object. This is what it would look like on a sphere. So it is going to look a little bit different. We could also change the scale so we could see that a little bit better. And changing our scale to 0.5 might give us a little bit better representation of what it's actually going to look like. So we're going to select our fractal node for our density. And I'm just going to pull down our input nodes and move these over so they're underneath each other. And that way we can frame this so you can see it a little bit better. And I'm going to be using a filter. So we just want to select our connection line between our node and our density, add a filter. And we could also use the filter that's built in to the actual material editor. but I'm going to select just to use this within the function editor. And that way we can change a lot of other settings from just the basic filter. We could use a partial filter. We could also use any number of these different settings to achieve different looks. So we want to be paying attention to our preview once we start editing this. So we're going to select our filter, right mouse click, go to Edit Filter, and now we can start to customize some of these options. If we turn it on curves, we can start to see a little bit of a different surface, and if we bring down the right side, which is basically going to adjust our density, where our white areas are going to start becoming a little more gray, which is going to affect the overall look and density of the entire surface. So what we might want to do is just pull this down so we have a curve really sloping inward, and that way we still reach the highest density where we want to, but our in-between values, and if we take a look at our preview, we can start to see a lot more black as opposed to the way it was before. We get more of an appearance of fire. So I'm going to click OK with this filter, OK again, and let's take a look at our preview. And we can already see that new definition. And because our color is still set up on the same node with the same sizes, we don't need to worry about adding that filter to our color, because we still want our color to be exactly the same as it is. We're just adjusting our density. And since they're both the same, basically the same thing, we don't need to worry about changing that. Now if you wanted this to be a little bit brighter still, you could always change your luminosity a little bit higher. If we bring this up to 250 and take a look, we can see some much brighter areas. But I'm just going to bring that back down to 200. Another thing we could also do is change our overall density. Either lower it, and now we can start to see through our surface a little bit more. And you might want to actually be able to see through your surface. So it really depends on how dense you want your fire to be, and exactly what it is that it's going to be with. Because if you're going to have this fire on a specific object, if your density is too low, you're going to see too much of that object in the fire. But if it's too high, you might not see the object at all. So this setting might need to be changed. And if you're losing the luminosity that you want, with some of the lower density settings, you can see we're at 2.5 right now. Really can't see the overall brightness, but we can adjust our luminosity, bring that up to 300, and now it starts to look a little bit better. And we'll still be able to see through that fire if we're placing it on an object. We could also bring our density all the way up to 10, which is going to be our highest density. And we can really see that overall effect. But also keep in mind, we can adjust our density higher than 10. Our slider allows us to go up to 10, but we can always type in a number to go a little bit higher. So I could type this and bring this up to 20. And now we can really see how dense that fire is. And this would basically be consuming any object that we have on it. And you also need to keep in mind the overall exposure of your scene, because if it's going to be a very bright day where you're having fire, you're not going to want extremely white areas. If you're in a darker scene, then definitely the brightest thing is going to be the fire and not anything else. So you want to have that turned down a little bit. We can bring this down to about 9 and take a look. And that looks like it's pretty good. But one thing I might want to do is just stretch this out a little bit more, because right now we have that current setting. We're just going to go to the density edit function. And if we take a look at our fractal, we have that set to 0.4. Well, let's bring that up to 0.5 on our z-axis. Click OK. And now you can see our color doesn't really match up anymore. So we need to go to our volumetric color, edit our function, and under that fractal node, change our Z to 5 to match it up. Click OK. And now it starts to match up again. Just so that we have, in the areas where it starts to disappear, it'll start to turn more of that darker orange color. And then once it gets to the really dense areas, we have it at white. Now we could also change our gradient map and adjust our color if we need to. But first what we're going to do is just render out another preview and take a look at the overall animation and with our new density values, how this is going to look. So we can either left mouse click to generate a preview, or we can right mouse click first and set some of our different settings that we have. And I'm going to increase our preview size so you can see that a little bit better. And we're going to keep that on final and click OK and just let that preview render out. We can see it's much larger now, and you'll get a better representation of how this fire is going to look once it's done. And now we can scrub through and take a look at the animation and see how our fire is moving and its overall effect. And it looks pretty good overall. One thing I want to do is just render out another frame so we can take a look at this a little more in full of how it's going to look. So we just take a look at our render options. And I'm just going to create another 800 by 600 render. And this frame is saved out as fireframe underscore 002. So you can see without the compression settings of the video once again. But overall it looks pretty good. We still have a lot of sort of blurriness on the outside, and we might want a little bit of a crisper fire. So what we can do is actually use some combiner nodes with our fractal to look for something that's going to give us some more defined edges and an overall better looking fire. But we can see that new stretching really showing up, looks a little bit better. But we still need to change a few things in order to get it to really look completely realistic. Let's go ahead and close that out. We're going to go back to our first frame.